Rome's Fiumicino Airport moves through another afternoon with its usual noise and steady flow of people. Luggage rolls across polished floors, families split off with quick hugs, and business travelers flip through documents as they rush toward their gates. In the middle of that routine chaos, a man in a dark suit closes a newspaper with a deliberate, practiced motion. He stays quiet, yet his eyes drift from corner to corner as if he has memorized every route out, every camera angle, every space where someone could pass unseen. No one around him senses that a covert plan set in motion by Mossad is close to reaching its most delicate stage high above the clouds, where normal rules lose meaning and the line between retribution and legality turns vague. Alitalia Flight 504, headed for Istanbul, prepares for departure. To the rest of the passengers, it is nothing more than a standard trip. But one seat on that aircraft hides a purpose that will never appear in any newspaper the next morning. The idea itself seems impossible. Remove a target during a flight packed with strangers. Avoid any trace that investigators could follow. Keep the crew unaware and prevent even a hint of alarm. Yet this is the sort of problem that intelligence services try to solve, using agents who move under assumed names and operate so smoothly that even seasoned Hamas members, trained to notice anything suspicious, can overlook the danger standing a few steps away. The individual marked for elimination was Nabil Kazim, known in underground channels as Abu Tariq. He managed logistics and turned several European cities into a reliable source of funding for operations extending across the continent and beyond. His work helped sustain networks that did not rely on borders or public visibility. Taking him out was not just about removing one figure, it meant disrupting a larger structure, sending a signal to Hamas operatives spread throughout Europe, and testing how far Israel was willing to go with targeted killings far from its own territory. Operation Aquascienciosa, the name later written into classified archives, came after years of patient observation, quiet penetration of circles connected to Nabil Qassem, and tightly timed movements that only a service like Mossad could coordinate. Understanding how it unfolded requires looking at the man Israel judged dangerous enough to justify a killing on neutral ground, the steps that brought the team into place, and the reason this single mission still fuels arguments over ethics, strategy, and state power. Who was Nabil Qassem? He entered the world in Hebron in 1951, during a period when tensions in Palestine rose year after year. Families watched their land disappear and grew up with a sense of resistance woven into their lives. For a child there, daily life meant witnessing patrols, clashes, and the slow shaping of an identity built around conflict and survival.
Abu Tariq carried that environment with him from the beginning, and it shaped the path he would later follow, one that eventually made him the central figure of a mission carried out many thousands of meters above the ground. He stayed far from crowds and cameras. While loud leaders spoke in squares or sat for televised interviews, he moved quietly, choosing a path where almost no one noticed him. Over time, he turned into the hidden planner behind the money system that kept Hamas functioning across Europe. Others wanted attention. Abu Tariq avoided it, working in silence as he built financial channels so tangled that Western agencies spent years trying to understand them. His story had nothing to do with lecture halls or diplomatic circles. It grew in secret spaces, shaped by the strict habits of someone who understood that one wrong move could lead to prison or to death. His beliefs did not come from theory or university debates. They came from life inside the Palestinian resistance, where armed struggle was viewed as basic defense against an occupation that ignored every boundary and every right. He refused political negotiation with Israel, seeing any attempt at compromise as a betrayal of the cause and of the many people lost through decades of fighting. His real education was the underground. Before the online world existed, he learned how to pass messages safely. He set up ways to move money without triggering the global banking alarms. Over the years, he built a reputation for steady, precise work, enough that groups in Europe depended on him. Each euro or dollar that moved through his hands held meaning. It could turn into supplies, weapons, or support for families tied to the struggle. It was a kind of distant economic battle, fought far from gunfire, but still able to shape events on the ground. Israel improved its covert capabilities year after year, and Abu Tariq answered by sharpening his ability to disappear. In Europe, he directed a web of contacts stretching through Rome, Paris, Istanbul, and Beirut. He used front organizations, shell businesses, and sometimes mosques as quiet places to meet. On paper, his job seemed simple: gather funds from sympathizers, guide them through channels that could slip past Mossad and European services, and make sure the money reached trusted people in the Palestinian territories. But the reality was harder and riskier. Israeli security circles accused him of helping finance suicide attacks that marked the 1990s, attacks that left lasting wounds on Israeli society. These accusations pushed his name to the top of targeted killing lists. Still, he never sought the role of spokesman. He did not deliver stirring talks or issue bold public statements. His messages came coded, his instructions arrived encrypted. Most people never saw him at all. Yet behind everything, he acted as the steady link that kept the machinery running.
Israel understood that removing him, even for a short while, could disrupt the entire structure. The period mattered too. The late 1990s in the Middle East carried a strange mix of hope and danger. The Oslo Accords suggested a possible path toward a negotiated peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Headlines around the world spoke of promise and new beginnings. But beneath that surface, older tensions, rival strategies, and underground conflicts continued, shaping the choices of men like Abu Tariq and those determined to stop him. Armed groups like Hamas pushed their attacks even harder, trying to break any sign of diplomatic movement. For them, talks meant giving up the idea of full resistance, so they saw negotiations as a direct threat. This tension turned cities such as Rome, Istanbul, and Beirut into quiet battlegrounds. There were no tanks, no jets overhead. Instead, the fight moved through hidden channels, bank wires sent under layers of disguise, people using borrowed identities, and support teams working out of basements and back rooms. Israel answered by sharpening its own intelligence methods. It expanded covert operations and built a system of targeted killings meant to stop attacks long before they could happen. Mossad pushed farther into the strategy, and soon the idea of killing without trial was being discussed not only by soldiers and spies, but also by lawyers and diplomats who worried about the limits of international law. Inside this growing pressure, Hamas strengthened its stance against any diplomatic path. Its network in Europe became essential for keeping its actions in Israel and the West Bank alive. Abu Tariq rose within this structure as a central operator. He handled money streams that slipped quietly through Rome Ficino Airport, using the airport's constant movement to set up short, unnoticed meetings. He built channels that sent funds from Istanbul to Gaza with help from contacts in Beirut. And he directed financing for the cells that carried out the bus attacks in the year 1996, attacks that killed many Israeli civilians. He also managed the logistics for getting explosives into the region. Shipments came from Jordan, hidden among regular goods, and he helped bring in foreign specialists who trained local groups in bomb construction. He did all of this with fake papers and careful cover stories. Every action left almost nothing to trace.
Even when European police caught low-level helpers or blocked accounts that looked suspicious, the core structure kept moving. Abu Tariq always prepared a backup route, a new messenger, or a fresh safe house. Nothing stopped for long. Western intelligence services, Italian, French, Turkish, and others, watched these webs more closely each year. But the work felt like chasing shadows. Each arrest exposed only a thin slice of the wider network.
In 1997, Italian officers picked up 3 people tied to strange transfers, yet none mentioned Abu Tariq while being questioned. That same year, accounts in Vienna were frozen after a financing inquiry, but the funds had already taken different paths. Authorities kept catching minor figures, closing accounts, and tracking movements, which split some cells apart but never destroyed the whole system. Abu Tariq stayed ahead of everyone. He pushed risky jobs onto younger operatives who took the blows if something went wrong. They became buffers that protected him while he kept running things from behind the curtain. Always hidden, always one move ahead. His ability to stay operational under pressure made him priceless for Hamas and, at the same time, a serious problem for Israel. To Israeli analysts, he was not just someone who handled logistics. They saw him as the person who shaped and drove a series of attacks that had left long-lasting wounds in Israeli society. Earlier Israeli actions against Hamas support figures had already set certain patterns. There had been efforts to detain people through cooperation with local police, invitations to routine questioning that turned into something else, and, in a few unusual cases, quiet operations that ended with bodies discovered in hotel rooms in Europe or vehicles going up in flames for reasons no one could clearly explain. These incidents formed a working model inside the intelligence community. Taking out a coordinator away from familiar ground was viewed as achievable and often preferable. Striking someone inside Gaza carried too many risks: civilian casualties, political backlash, and a wave of international criticism that Israel wanted to avoid. A subtle move overseas, on the other hand, could be presented as an unfortunate accident or a sudden health issue. Debates about ethics and legality were already loud among human rights groups, but for Mossad planners, the issue was simpler: stop the threat before it turned into more dead civilians on Israeli streets. That cold logic shaped the quiet, hidden arena in which Operation Aqua Silenciosa began forming inside closed rooms in Tel Aviv. Preparation came well before the Rome-Istanbul flight. The mission that would redirect the course of Abu Tariq's life was marked in internal files under the codename Aqua Silenciosa, a title chosen to suggest something silent and fluid, something that could move through any space without leaving a trail. Planning had started months earlier when analysts noticed repeating behavior in his travel schedule. He moved between Rome and Istanbul often, always passing through Rome's Fiumicino airport, using it as a steady meeting point for discussions with Hamas contacts.
They recorded hours, routes, companions, and small details about his behavior. Every gesture and pause was logged. The goal was to find that single opening, the brief lapse that even skilled operatives eventually show. Mossad needed to turn a seasoned intelligence figure into someone exposed, at least for a moment. That took patience, wide resources, and timing sharp enough to leave no room for mistakes. Only a service with Mossad's experience could attempt something like this. The infiltration began through an operative working under commercial cover, a man who had crafted his false life over many months. His documents held up to scrutiny. His work history appeared solid. He attended public events to build visibility. He even maintained social media accounts that felt too ordinary to doubt. Under the name Yosef Dagan, he appeared to be a representative of an import-export firm with offices in Tel Aviv and Rome, someone who moved through airports and business meetings without raising suspicion from anyone, including Abu Tariq.
The cover story was built so carefully that even a long and thorough check would struggle to find anything off. He showed up at the same small cafes Abu Tariq liked, took seats close by, kept a steady but unremarkable routine, and never acted curious. After seeing him a few times, most people would treat him as part of the usual background. He blended into local habits at a slow, steady pace. Short chats about Italian football, quick jokes about Roman traffic, plain remarks on European politics that never crossed into risky ground. The goal was simple. When the key moment came, Abu Tariq would see a familiar face at the airport or maybe on Alitalia Flight 504 and feel nothing unusual. But the smooth plan began to show strain. During boarding, small details hinted that things might slip out of control. Abu Tariq, known for traveling alone or with at most one person, reached the gate flanked by 3 men who clearly were not casual travelers. They watched the area with the sharp, practiced focus of people trained to catch threats. Their presence added noise to a situation that was supposed to stay predictable. A few short exchanges with nearby passengers added even more risk. What if someone recognized the agent from a cafe or a street in Rome? What if one of the 3 men was skilled at spotting undercover work? The remote team handling contingency planning had to adjust all probability models on the spot, running new assessments every few seconds. Calling off the operation meant giving up a rare opening that might not return for several months. Moving ahead meant stepping into a situation where every new second increased the chance of a public incident. In the last moments before boarding, the choice was made to continue. The reasoning was cold but clear. Removing Abu Tariq promised long-term strategic value that outweighed the rising danger.
This was not Israel's first attempt to stop the Hamas coordinator. Records showed 2 earlier efforts that had come close but failed. Each failure had shaped their understanding of his habits. In 1996, the Paris attempt collapsed when he sensed a tail, switched hotels after midnight, and vanished for weeks before showing up again in Beirut. In 1998, Turkish police almost caught him in Istanbul after an anonymous tip that was likely pushed by Israeli sources. But flawless forged documents and a fast move by a well-connected attorney got him released in less than 1 day. Every missed chance filled out his profile. They learned he trusted a few contacts more than he should. He tended to ease up when crossing borders, and he never fully grasped how far Israeli surveillance could reach inside Europe. Previous arrests of operatives tied to him had already exposed plenty about how money moved, how messages were sent, and which intermediaries kept the network alive. But every new lead also made the remaining cells across Europe more skittish, more convinced that each conversation might be monitored and every meeting might be a trap. With paranoia spreading, every fresh attempt to intercept Abu Tariq's circle carried heavier risks. And now, with Abu Tariq sitting on Alitalia 504, Mossad faced not just a chance to eliminate a dangerous figure, but also a moment to see how far an operation could stretch the edges of international law without tipping the world into a diplomatic mess that could not be undone. Alitalia Flight 504 left Rome, Fiumicino, right on schedule at 2:35 in the afternoon. An Airbus A320 moved steadily over the Mediterranean, heading toward Istanbul, with 187 people strapped into their seats. Executives scrolled through slide decks, parents kept kids entertained, students tuned out with music. No one imagined that among them sat a man whose life had been quietly marked to end before landing. Abu Tariq sat in seat 23C, an aisle spot that let him track movement up and down the corridor and slip to the bathroom fast if he had to send or receive a brief message. 6 rows ahead, under a borrowed name and a rehearsed backstory, Yosef Dan occupied 17A, pressed against the window with an Italian novel open on his lap, though he never turned a page with real interest. His attention lived in the reflections on the glass, the posture of the cabin crew, the subtle shifts in passenger behavior. He watched for the small signs that meant the window for action was getting close. The engine drone wrapped the cabin in steady white noise, swallowing half-heard words and soft footsteps. At 10,000 meters, the usual rules of the ground felt vague, as if the plane existed in a thin pocket where consequences hovered but had not yet chosen a direction.
A tight, quiet tension settled over everything, invisible to the passengers, but sharp between the two men. The moment arrived during the drinks run, when carts blocked parts of the aisle and people stood waiting for restrooms, creating a stream of small movements that blurred together. Yusuf rose as if heading to the back, keeping a steady, unhurried pace. Ahead of him, he noticed Abu Tariq also leaving his seat. The narrow passage guaranteed they would cross paths, something Yusuf had pictured again and again during training. They edged toward each other, and when they finally met shoulder to shoulder, Yusuf let his eyes widen just a touch, playing the part of someone recognizing a familiar face. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Qasim? We met in Rome at the importers' conference, right?" The line landed exactly as intended. Abu Tariq, skilled at staying in character no matter the situation, offered a small, controlled smile and replied, "You are mistaken, my friend." The exchange should have ended there, simple and forgettable. But Yusuf lifted his hand in an apologetic gesture, friendly and harmless on the surface. And Abu Tariq, trying not to draw attention, accepted the handshake. Those few seconds, no more than 3, were enough. A tiny needle hidden in the ring on Yusuf's finger brushed Abu Tariq's skin and pushed a measured drop of toxin into his palm. The dose was small, quiet, and designed to take effect soon, leaving no chance for him to realize the moment that sealed his fate. There was no shout, no sudden collapse, nothing more dramatic than a brief tightening of his expression, the kind of look a person gives when someone brushes past them in a cramped space. The two men simply drifted apart, each moving on as if the moment meant nothing. One walked toward the bathroom, the other returned to his seat, and for anyone watching, it looked like a passing inconvenience between strangers on a routine flight. No one imagined it was the start of a slow, irreversible ending. The crew reacted fast once they realized something was wrong. A flight attendant called for medical help, and a doctor seated in business class hurried over. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation started right there in the narrow aisle, with passengers twisting in their seats to see what was happening, caught between curiosity and the unease that always comes with emergencies in tight spaces. The portable defibrillator was brought out and used not once, but twice, then a third and fourth time. Each shock jerked Abu Tariq's body in a way that made nearby passengers flinch, yet no steady heartbeat followed. Minute after minute passed, with no improvement. After roughly 27 minutes from the first sign of distress, the doctor stopped, checked once more, and stated plainly that the man was gone. That left the captain with a choice. He could divert to the nearest airport or continue toward Istanbul. The risks and costs of changing course were huge, and with the passenger already dead, it would do nothing for him. The captain chose to fly on. The crew covered the body with a blanket and moved it to a quiet corner of the cabin, and I'll tell you, Flight 504 kept going as though the routine had resumed. Still, the mood on board shifted. People whispered. Flight attendants kept their composure but carried a strained look, already thinking about the questions waiting for them on arrival. Yusuf Dogan stayed in his seat, unnoticed, just one more traveler among many. When the plane landed, he joined the long stream of passengers and disappeared into the crowds of the Turkish airport. By the time anyone tried to piece things together, he was already gone. And Operation Aqua Sensosa was finished. Its effects, though, were only starting to spread. News of Abu Tariq's death reached Hamas leadership quickly. The first reaction was muted grief, mixed with a deep, immediate suspicion that tightened through the organization.
A seasoned logistics coordinator does not simply die of a heart failure at 47 without raising doubts. Public messaging stayed cautious, using respectful phrases about a fallen brother serving the cause, avoiding any direct accusation or mention of how he died. It led like something crafted for outside eyes. Inside the organization, the tone was different. Orders went out without delay. Every operative working in Europe had to pause international movement, check personal security habits, and behave as if they were already under close watch. Meetings in person were shut down. Funding channels that moved through Rome, Fiumicino, and Istanbul were put on hold. The web of contacts that Abu Tariq had built over years pulled back, each part isolating itself so that a hit on one would not expose the others. Messages promising retaliation circulated, coded, and careful, but under the surface, their stance sounded more defensive than aggressive, the posture of a network bracing for whatever might follow rather than preparing to strike out immediately. At the start, they had to sort out the basics. They needed a clear picture of what actually went wrong, how MSAD got that close without anyone noticing, and who else might end up on the same list. Reactions inside the communities that felt the impact did not line up in one direction. People argued quietly, traded small pieces of news, and tried to make sense of a death that had no solid proof of foul play. With no evidence of an extrajudicial killing, the official line about a natural medical problem set the tone in the early days after the incident on Alitalia Flight 504. In the Rome mosques where Abu Tariq was known, they prayed for him. No imam accused Israel in public. The silence hung thick, and the looks people exchanged said more than any sermon could.
In Gaza and the West Bank, a few scattered protests formed, but they stayed muted, missing the usual force seen when deaths are tied directly to Israeli actions. The lack of clarity left the grief stuck halfway, like a story paused before the ending, waiting for proof that no one expected to appear. Arab outlets covered the news with careful headlines. Palestinian coordinator dies on international flight. European papers barely gave it a line, treating it as another medical emergency among the many that happen every year on commercial planes. That quiet was part of why the operation worked. No broken body, no blast, no dramatic scene. Nothing for cameras to show, nothing for crowds to rally around. Without images, there was no spark to push the public into outrage. Turkish authorities handled the body at Istanbul airport by the book. They logged the death, reached out to the family through Palestinian diplomats, and released the remains for burial after the usual medical checks. Those checks, as expected, pointed only to sudden heart failure. The official report from Turkey was short and dry, written almost like routine paperwork, avoiding any hint that this might be a crime. Istanbul already carried enough diplomatic weight and did not want new fights between Israel and Palestinian groups landing on its desk. The family requested an autopsy, and Turkey agreed. But the results took many weeks. When the findings finally arrived, they did not offer solid answers. Some traces looked like they could be toxins, or they could be ordinary changes that happen after death. The tests opened more doubts instead of closing them. Turkey kept a neutral line in public, saying there was no proof of wrongdoing and marking the case as a natural death. That way, Ankara stayed clear of trouble with Italy, the owner of the plane, avoided friction with Israel, which denied everything, and did not provoke Palestinian factions that demanded justice but lacked evidence. Israel held to its usual position of plausible deniability. No confirmation, no denial. Intelligence analysts abroad whispered their theories, compared fragments, and worked behind the scenes, while the Israeli government moved forward with its plans as if the whole affair had never taken place. It played out like one more careful maneuver in a long history of quiet moves, the kind people assume the Mossad carries out, but can never pin down. Reports clashed. In the days after the incident, international outlets started stitching together scattered accounts. Reporters compared what passengers from Alitalia Flight 504 remembered with what specialists in covert work said about patterns long associated with Mossad operations. Papers in Europe, including Le Monde and Der Spiegel, ran guarded pieces. They hinted that Abu Tariq's death looked odd, but they stopped short of blaming Israel, since no firm proof existed.
People who sat near him recalled the sudden wave of sickness, the rushed attempts to revive him, and the moment a doctor declared him gone. Everything lined up with a routine cardiac event, at least on the surface. The only part that stood out came from a few passengers who spotted a man talking to Abu Tariq in the aisle moments before the symptoms appeared. Analysts used to tracking signals in intelligence work noted how this detail echoed earlier cases of targeted hits that relied on fast-acting agents designed to leave almost nothing recognizable in standard tests. The idea of an extrajudicial killing started to form in private conversations, though it stayed in a gray zone where many believed the story but knew it would never survive a courtroom. As soon as hints of these suspicions seeped into public view, the argument over legality and ethics flared. Scholars and rights groups dug in, asking what international law actually allows when a government claims national security as its shield. Experts pointed out that, if true, the act would break Italian sovereignty at the point of departure, Turkish sovereignty at the point of arrival, and the rules governing international airspace in between. 3 separate breaches, each serious enough to spark penalties and possibly a volatile diplomatic fight. Others looked at the event through the lens of military ethics. Was it justified to take out a logistics coordinator, someone who never held a weapon but whose financial work supported attacks that killed Israeli civilians? The more people compared this case with past situations, the more heated the discussion became. If Israel could strike someone on a commercial flight without facing fallout, what stopped other states from doing the same? Would Russia feel free to target a dissident on a European route? Would China try something similar with Tibetan activists? In the end, the strategic weight of the operation stretched far beyond the moment itself. It raised hard questions about precedent and possible imitation. Even those who favored firm counter-terror measures found the implications unsettling, as if the whole affair had opened a box of scenarios no one was prepared to manage. Factual doubts around the clashing pieces of the case kept feeding new theories that spread through intelligence circles and the usual online spaces focused on covert work and state conspiracies. Some passengers insisted they had seen Abu Tariq speaking with 2 men before boarding, not only with the suspected infiltrated agent who appeared during the flight. People argued over who those men might have been. Maybe they were linked to the operation. Maybe they were regular Hamas escorts who either backed off or failed to watch him. Later reviews of his travel documents added more questions. A ticket bought under a name that did not fully match the passport. A hotel booking in Istanbul canceled just a few hours before departure. Small details that could be nothing more than sloppy clerical work, or they could point to a deeper, more layered plan. Another line of thought focused on a possible betrayal from inside. Some analysts push the idea that someone in the network in Europe might have sold Abu Tariq's route to Israel in exchange for protection or money. This idea grew because Mossad rarely moves without strong human sources, and the tight execution of Operation Acquiescenza hinted at someone feeding precise information on the target's routines, paths, and weak points. Each competing theory tried to fill the same gaps, and each one carried both convincing elements and clear holes. What tied them all together was the simple fact that none could be proven. The whole incident fit the pattern of a well-run covert mission where the real story ends up buried under layers of uncertainty, vanished files, and enough ambiguity to keep any direct answer out of reach. This new sense of exposure pushed other coordinators to change their habits fast. Trips were postponed or scrapped. In-person meetings gave way to encrypted exchanges. Caution turned into constant tension. For roughly 4 to 6 months after the Alitalia Flight 504 episode, Western intelligence services logged a noticeable drop in suspicious activity connected to the financing lines of Palestinian armed groups. But the story of underground movements has always been one of quick recovery, and Hamas, even while absorbing the loss of Abu Tariq, showed within a short time that the blow, though heavy, would not cripple the system he helped build. Other operatives with years of financial work across Europe stepped in to close the gap. Many had spent long periods in quiet sleeper units in places like Paris, Amsterdam, and Berlin, where they had earned steady trust inside the organization while staying invisible to local authorities. The funding system was rebuilt from scratch, with far stricter separation between teams. Instead of relying on a single figure who knew every channel, each person handled only a small part of the whole chain. This limited the fallout if another targeted killing ever happened again.
New identities were issued, new backup routes were drawn through countries with softer oversight, and updated transfer techniques were added. Even digital currencies, still obscure in the late 1990s, started to play a role. Because of all this, the long-term impact of Operation Aqua Sensiosa stayed smaller than many expected. Israel scored a short-term win, but the broader intelligence struggle did not slow down. Hamas managed to rebuild its structure and keep operating, though with more restraint, more caution, and methods that were harder for security services to map. Outside reactions were also muted. With no public proof and a ready Israeli denial, the incident never built enough momentum to spark major diplomatic disputes or sanctions. Italy, which owned the aircraft where everything happened, ran quiet reviews behind closed doors. Nothing came out that officially tied the case to an extrajudicial killing. On paper, the death stayed listed as natural causes. Turkey, the country where the flight was meant to land, acted the same way. It avoided pushing the issue since it was trying to maintain a delicate balance at its ties around the Middle East. Most of the real debate unfolded in foreign policy forums, legal institutes, and rights groups that had been tracking the slow rise of covert killings carried out far from home soil. These discussions were detailed and persistent, but even well-argued criticism rarely shifted actual state policy. The deeper consequence of the operation was more subtle. It added one more example to a long pattern of Israeli activity outside its borders. Over time, such cases made once rare methods feel routine and cleared space for future missions that would test even broader limits. And this opens a larger question about how these events shape not just short-term tactics, but the whole moral framework around state security. How far a government can go and what becomes normalized over the years remains at the center of the dispute. That is why Operation Aqua Sensiosa turned into a landmark case, one that still splits opinions depending on where you stand in the larger geopolitical picture, especially among those who defend Israeli decisions in this era. It shows a kind of practical force meant to block threats before they turn into real bloodshed. The idea is simple. Take out the people who keep the networks running, and you cut the chain that leads to bombs on buses or crowded streets. In this game, Abu Tariq was not some quiet office worker handling forms and bank transfers. He was a key part of a system built to cause death. Every euro he sent on its way, every path he organized, every meeting he lined up, pushed the machinery forward. Those actions fed the attacks that tore apart families and markets or cafes filled with people who never imagined they were in danger. From this angle, poisoning him on a regular passenger flight, while disturbing to many, looked like the lesser evil.
It was seen as a cleaner choice than letting him keep shaping networks that would later support more killings. Supporters argue that waiting for a perfect legal setting would have meant waiting for more civilians to die. They point to the urgency of stopping someone who helped keep the flow of money, personnel, and materials moving across borders. Critics see something very different. To them, the operation made Israel look like a country that prefers shadow work over open process. They argue it stepped into friendly states without permission, dismissed international rules, and acted as judge, jury, and executioner. They warn that this path eats away at the legal and moral standards that hold the global system together. Once such actions become routine, it becomes harder to draw lines or uphold norms that protect weaker nations. In the first weeks after Abu Tariq's death, the impact seemed clear. Some financing routes stalled. A few networks struggled to adjust. Israeli and Western intelligence units gained a short window in which their own monitoring and planning got easier. But the picture changed with time. Hamas rebuilt its structure and paid close attention to what had gone wrong. It studied how the hit was prepared. It picked apart the mistakes that let its key man become exposed. People inside the group tightened their habits. They changed travel patterns. They avoided anything that looked predictable. They upgraded false identities. They treated airports and flights like traps, where a casual chat or a harmless request might mask a threat. They added new layers of security that made later operations far harder to carry out. Agents sent after future targets now faced more risk, more uncertainty, and more room for failure. In a strange twist, removing Abu Tariq may have shaped a tougher generation of logistical operatives. They became more careful, more skilled, and harder to follow. Some analysts compare it to a kind of selection process inside the world of intelligence, where only the most guarded and adaptable figures stay alive. Each loss pushes the group to evolve, building systems that resist the next attempt. The long-term result was not a clean win. It turned into another round in a cycle where one strike leads to new defenses, and every defense forces the next strike to be even more complex. The boundary between justice, retaliation, and unintended harm grew blurry. The case sparked arguments far beyond the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. People began asking what counts as a fair act of war now, when threats move quietly, cross borders, and blend into civilian life. The core issue is no longer just about one state or one movement. It touches the larger question of how modern nations fight and what limits they agree to keep when they operate in the shadows.
If a state can strike a target in neutral airspace on a commercial flight without a trial or any public scrutiny, relying only on its own internal threat reading, then what real protection is left for dissidents, journalists, activists, or anyone a government decides to label as a problem? The Abu Tariq case puts these doubts front and center. It forces people to ask whether the response fit the threat. Was he truly such an imminent danger that it made sense to endanger more than 180 innocent travelers, sealed inside a pressurized cabin where any error could turn catastrophic? And about verification, who can honestly vouch that the intelligence was solid, that there was no mistaken identity, no flawed interpretation, no chain of assumptions that made Israel believe the target was exactly who they thought he was? Then there is the issue of precedent. If Israel carries out something like this without facing serious pushback, what lesson does that give to authoritarian states that already view exiles and critics abroad as fair game? Military ethics have long lived in uncertain zones, but actions like Operation Aqua Silenciosa stretch these zones until they resemble something closer to a void. Even people who normally defend aggressive counter-terror tactics find themselves wondering whether the damage done to global norms, the risks created for civilians, and the hit to moral standing outweigh the short bursts of tactical advantage. So we return to the first question. What actually changed after Abu Tariq was taken out mid-flight between Rome and Istanbul? The difficult truth is that the result was smaller than supporters hoped and broader than detractors want to admit. The hit slowed certain logistical networks, cut funding lines that took months to repair, and sent a sharp message to Hamas coordinators spread across Europe. It shook their sense of safety and forced them to rethink their movements. But it did not shift the direction of the conflict. It did not stop the repeated cycles of retaliation. It did not create any lasting security or open a path toward peace for either side. What it did achieve was something more abstract but still tangible. It raised the mental cost for operatives who travel under aliases. It turned airports like Rome Fiumicino into places where every shadow feels like surveillance. And it showed yet again that Mossad's reach crosses borders and ignores the idea of neutral ground. Tactics changed after that day. Security routines were rewritten from scratch. A new wave of operatives learned that the silent war woven through international espionage leaves no truly safe stops, only brief moments that feel safe until they are not. The final look at Operation Aqua Silenciosa forces a larger point into view: the tension between short-term effectiveness and the legal, moral, and diplomatic fallout that follows.
Clean hits like this may stop a coordinator whose work leads to real casualties, and in that sense they may save lives in the immediate moment. But they also plant unclear and dangerous markers for the rest of the world. When a state shows that it can remove a target on a commercial plane without facing meaningful penalties, without losing backing from allies, and without absorbing real diplomatic damage, the result is not just a temporary tactical success. It becomes a shift in what other governments believe they can get away with next. It sets up a steady new baseline where extrajudicial killings slip into the routine toolkit of foreign policy. What used to be an argument in classrooms about military ethics and international law turns into a matter of survival. And the question hangs there: are we shaping a world where any government feels free to act as judge and executioner anywhere its enemies happen to be? The long-term impact of the operation is not limited to what happened to Hamas after the death of Abu Tariq. It also lies in what this move quietly signaled to every other state actor watching from a distance and taking careful notes. The image that stays is the man in the dark suit at Rome's Fiumicino airport, folding his newspaper with calm, almost detached motions. He stands between two realities, an accidental witness to a conflict most people have no clue is unfolding around them. And while families head off on vacations and executives scroll through slides on their laptops, covert actions move along the same walkways, pass through the same boarding gates, settle into the same cramped seats under the same flat fluorescent lights that make everything look so ordinary. The voice that once asked, "How can someone be eliminated at 10,000 meters without leaving a trace?" now turns towards something heavier. It wonders whether the real cost of these operations, measured not through saved lives or neutralized threats, but through weakened norms and new precedents, was ever justified. And, as with most parts of this world of espionage, improvised decisions, and moral puzzles with no clean answers, the response depends entirely on where you happen to be sitting when the plane lifts off. Now that you know the hidden path of Operation Aqua Silenciosa and have a clearer sense of how espionage actually works, far from cameras and far from loud headlines, another question waits for you. What will you do with this understanding? No one is asking you to turn into a spy or to suspect every friendly face you meet at an airport. The point is something else: paying closer attention to how power really moves in the background of geopolitics, seeing how choices made by intelligence officers in private rooms shape the world in ways most people never notice. Learning about operations like this is not about celebrating force or choosing sides in conflicts that stretch back decades.
It is about accepting that the real world is far more tangled than any simple story suggests. And now you have to ask yourself, can you see how thin the boundary is between protecting a nation and crossing into violations that echo for years?
How tactics that look efficient in the moment can set patterns that become dangerous down the line. These are not empty questions. They are real problems facing governments, intelligence services, and anyone trying to stay informed. So think about this for a moment. How many similar operations might be unfolding right now while you sit here watching this video? How many Yusuf Dons are drifting through commercial flights, sitting in European cafes, or waiting in five-star hotels for a signal that will trigger missions no one outside a small circle will ever hear about? And there's another point here. How far are you ready to accept that your own government, whichever one you live under, might carry out similar actions in your name while saying it's for your safety? That's not a simple thing to sit with, and that's why it's worth taking a moment to think about it. What you've picked up from this isn't meant for showing off in late-night talks. It's meant to sharpen how you reason, to help you push back on official stories, and to see that public statements and hidden decisions often shape the world with the same weight. If you've reached this part and feel that this kind of slow, careful, fact-based work is exactly what you've been searching for, then go ahead and subscribe to the channel and switch on notifications. Each week, I bring you stories drawn from real intelligence work, espionage cases, geopolitical struggles, and the ethical problems that sit behind major choices in our era. This isn't throwaway content. It's meant to build a space for people who won't settle for simple explanations and who want to understand the unseen systems that guide governments, secret services, and underground networks. And before you close the page, leave a comment. After hearing about Abu Tarak and Operation Aqua Silenciosa, do you think targeted killing in the name of national security can ever be justified? Or do you see it as a clear break with international law that shouldn't be allowed under any circumstances? I'd like to hear your real view. I read every comment, and the back and forth that happens there is what turns information into something that actually changes how we see things.